These are, as Elder Webb indicated before, these are fearful times, and there's much to be afraid of. To face the future is not always easy. The scriptures often deal with the subject of fear among the believers. It's common for human beings to be what? To be afraid. Yet you would hardly know it. People dread showing that they are afraid. They would rather put on a brave face, what the British used to call a stiff upper lip. Sometimes, however, the circumstances dictate that we be afraid, and with good reason. But what about the fear of the Lord? Some explain it away. It's reverence, it's respect for God. And yet we have scriptures like Psalm 25 and verse 14. And I'll read that in your hearing. Psalm 25 and verse 14, where it says, "The secret of the Lord is with them that fear him, and he will show them his covenant." And today, we're going to look at a story called in the scriptures, Jesus calms the storm, or Jesus stills the tempest. And it is in Mark chapter 4, verses 35 to 41, which the sister just read for us. I'm using Mark's gospel today because it shares details not mentioned in either Matthew or Luke concerning the same story. So if we go into our text today, and we're going to try to stay in that text, Mark chapter 4, and I'll start with verse 35, and I'll comment on that. "And the same day, when the even was come, he said unto them, Let us pass over unto the other side. On the same day, that meant that very day. It had been a good day for Jesus and his disciples. Isn't it odd how a good day can often turn very bad on us? No such thing as a perfect day. Well, Proverbs 4:18 says, But the path of the just is just as a shining light that shineth more and more unto the perfect day. It's a fixed or appointed day. That's the day when Jesus returns, the perfect day. That will be a perfect day. But I want to tell you a story, and this is another one of these, back in the annals of the Elder Thom poor athletic career, back in the early 70s. And I was a little leaguer back in 1971. I was 10 or 11. And I was pitching in this particular game. And I usually played the outfield. But for some reason, a lot of people didn't show up that day, and I had to pitch. I am not a good pitcher. But for some reason, I was able to go through the first 3 innings, getting everybody out. So I had a perfect game. I was doing pretty good. And I thought, wow, and they can't even hit me today. What's going on? Well, then in the next inning, for some reason, the coach of the other team set up a kid that I'd never seen before. A big old country boy that I'd never seen before. And this is in Walk-Hill, across the river. And there's a Little League field there. And there's a bunch of pine trees behind the fence. Big pine trees, large growth of pine trees. I had seen people hit home runs over the fence, just barely over the fence. Little leaguers really have a hard time hitting the ball 250 feet, right? So most of the time, the Little League game back in those days was a walk, a little squib hit. You know what I mean? You were just running around the bases. But in this particular instance, I threw a pitch to that country boy, and he hit it as far as I'd ever seen a ball go in my life. It went over the pine trees and on into the whatever was behind there. And things started going downhill very quickly after that. When I got back to the dugout, my coach said to me that anything that flies that far should have a stewardess on it. That was a joke at the time, I guess. I didn't feel very good, but I had no perfect game and no perfect day. Just life with its ups and downs. I said a few minutes ago, it had been a good day for Jesus. But now we start to see the effects, good and bad, of the popularity of Jesus' ministry. Because Jesus' ministry attract what? Opposition, and it also attract the multitudes. And each caused a different set of problems. Jesus had been teaching in parables. the sower, the mustard seed, the fishing net. He was trying to show the people that it was not just physical healing he was interested in, but spiritual healing as well. It was the fall of 29 AD, and it was the second missionary tour through Galilee. Jesus was weary and exhausted by days of public ministry. He sought a respite from the crowds, but they closed about him. The solution? Crossing the lake. The day, a rather eventful one, was coming to a close. And in verse 36 there, it says, and when the multitude had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was, which was exhausted, in the ship. And there were also with him other little ships. And when they had sent away the multitude, they took him even as he was in the ship. He may not even have out of the ship. We have other details of him preaching right from the ship. They took him haggard and worn out, and they took him where he told them. He gave a command to depart unto the other side. He gave a command, following his own advice. In Mark 6 and verse 8, it says, take nothing for your journey, save a staff only. The Lord will provide. Now, let's talk a little bit about where they were going. The other side was Decapolis, the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee. It was a rather sparsely populated area. It was a heathen region. It is not surprising we find no record of the scribes and Pharisees following Jesus to this area. It was considered unclean, and it was truly a no man's land. Decapolis means 10 cities, and they were grouped together because their language and culture, they were centers of Greek and Roman culture in an area otherwise dominated by the Jews and the Arabs. The second part of the verse, and there were also with him other little ships. Mark presents certain witnesses to the miraculous event that was to occur. This is important because in this day and age, higher criticism has made it easy to doubt the stories of Jesus. But here Mark embeds in the story eyewitnesses in other boats, making us certain that his story is true. Now, the people were always eager to follow Jesus, eager to see him, eager to hear him. There were obviously other fishing boats near the shore, and it was in these little ships that they followed their master. It was almost dusk when the disciples pushed the boat away from the shore and began the trip across the lake. Now let's talk a little bit about this lake, the Sea of Galilee. It is 13 miles north to south and 8 miles wide. It also is about 680 feet below sea level. The climate was warm in this area, but the hills and valleys on the west brought giant funnels of cold wind across the lake. And that when the winds crashed into the warm air, what we call a warm front, it would create sudden, violent storms. I got that from William Barclay in one of his books. Mark 4:37 indicates that this was the case. It says, and there arose a great storm of wind, and the waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. In Matthew, full of water. In Matthew 8:24, he calls it a great tempest in the sea, insomuch that the ship was covered with the waves. I always thought about this, and recently my grandson got the movie Frozen, and I have everybody seen Frozen. And you know when Anna and Elsa's parents die in the ship and it's consumed by the waves? That's kind of what I guess is happening here. The waves are right over this ship. And it's a tempest. The tempest means, the Greek word means seismos, from which we get the word seismograph, from which we, how they measure earthquakes and how strong they are. It was a shaking of the sea, a turbulence of the great magnitude, and the wind struck the boat with tremendous, tremendous force. The day had been particularly calm, and the disciples did not anticipate any stormy weather. Just like I didn't anticipate that young man hitting that ball so far over the trees. But we must remember that some of these guys were fishermen, and they were trained on this very lake, and they should have known the lake's deadly reputation. However, just like us, their experience and their skill failed them. It's funny how often we do not rise to the occasion. We may pray every day, we may read our Bibles, but when something really serious happens, sometimes we're not there all the way. We don't do the right things. And we often attempt things without Jesus in our hearts, don't we? And we give him no thought when, after all, he should always be right there close at our side. I pray that you keep him near, especially in difficult situations. Always remember that you can send up a prayer at any time. So I continue. The waves beat into the ship so that it was now full. The boat was sinking, overwhelmed by the wind and the sea. Let's move on to verse 38, where it says, he was in the hinder part of the ship, asleep on a pillow. And they awake him and say unto him, Master, carest thou not that we perish? Interesting detail. And he was in the hinder of the ship. Sailors know that this is the stern, the back of the boat, and the bow is the front of the boat. And that's about all I know about ships. I've read Moby Dick, but that's about it. So it even tells us this little detail that he was asleep on a pillow. This was part of the boat's regular equipment, a leather cushion for the steersman who sat in the stern of the ship. Now, this is the only recorded instance of Jesus actually sleeping in the Gospels. We hear much about him praying throughout the night in secluded places, but here, he's actually sleeping. He was at peace. He had been doing his Father's will. This was for him a few hours' release from his labors. Overcome with weariness and hunger, it had been a most satisfying and strenuous day, so he had fallen asleep, and yet probably before the storm had even started. For why else would we hear, Master, carest not that we perish? And they then awakened him. The disciples seemed astonished that he could sleep through such a storm. Was he really unconcerned? Luke 8:24 says, Master, Master, we perish. It seems that the disciples are charging him with indifference to their plight. And we often do the same thing when it comes to Jesus. We do not see our problems answered in due time, and we begin to think that the Lord just doesn't care. In our fallen human condition, we become concerned, and we even doubt. And this reflects impatience and or despair on our part. We are just like the disciples. We have a human nature in a fallen world. And the story here is designed to help us. Sometimes we learn our lessons very slowly. The poet Charles Olson said the following, I have had to learn the simplest things last, which has made for many difficulties. It does. Sometimes we don't learn the simple lessons in life. We just keep making the same mistakes over and over again. In the next verse, Mark 4:39, it says, And he arose and rebuked the wind and said unto the sea, Peace, be still. Literally, be silent or be muzzled. Jesus rebuked the elements as if they were raging monsters. He does the same to the unclean spirits in Mark chapter 1 and verse 25. He says, Hold thy peace and come out of him. We should never doubt that God controls everything. Think about this Jesus controlling the wind, controlling the storm, controlling nature. Colossians 1 verses 16 and 17 puts it very precisely in Paul's writing, For by him were all things created, that are in heaven, that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created by him and for him. And he is before all things, and by him all things consist, or all things are held together. You know, a lot of times in this church, we tend to get mocked by people who don't understand prophecy, and they don't understand what we believe about prophecy. But this story, this particular story by Jesus, is hinted to even in the Old Testament, in the Psalms. It talks about God's power over these elements. In Psalm 89 and verse 9, it says, Thou rulest the raging of the sea. When the waves thereof arise, thou stillest them. It also says in Psalm 93:4, the Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. And here we see proof of that in the New Testament, that Jesus was able to do this. But based on God's word, we should never doubt that he is able to still the tempest or relieve the storms of life that so often, too often, burst unexpectedly on us. The conclusion of Mark 4:39 says, and the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. Amen. The suddenness of all this must have stunned the disciples. Mark 4 and verse 40 says, and he said unto them, why are ye so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? They had never seen him control the forces of nature. It might not even occur to them that he could do this. Ephesians 6 and verse 12 says, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, against the rulers of the age. Jesus has the upper hand in that struggle. And think about this. Satan, the demonic power, the power of the elements behind the raging tempest. We live in a fallen world, physically as well as material, as well as spiritually, yet Jesus has the ability to control all of this. And then in verse 41 it says, and they feared exceedingly and said one to another, what manner of man is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Amen. Psalm 33 and verse 8 and 9 says, let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spake, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. Let me make one statement about this. We do not experience his power in our lives because we are fearful and have little faith. Faith is the answer to our fear. A strong faith, a living faith. Think about what would have happened if Jesus had, or if the disciples had trusted in Jesus. They would not have what? Woken him up, right? The boat would not have sunk, and the storm would not have lasted. What if their faith had been strong and they were not afraid? Traveling with Jesus is to travel in peace amidst the storm of life. Sister White says in The Desire of Ages on page 336, living faith in the Redeemer will smooth the sea of life and will deliver us from danger in the way that he knows to be the best. The way that he knows to be the best. In the presence of Jesus, we can always have peace. No matter what storms of life we are going through, and we must admit that sin has destroyed our peace in many cases. It's why we need to cry out, Lord, save us. And let's think about some of the storms that we go through. And we like to avoid some of these. The first one I'm going to talk about is sorrow. And we like to avoid this one. It comes to all of us when we lose ones that we love, but he tells us of the glory of the life to come in our heavenly home when Jesus returns, and the blessed hope of meeting again those who have loved and who are asleep waiting for his return on that glorious day. So he gives us peace in the storm of sorrow. I'm going to read a little section here from Steps to Christ, page 100. It says, keep your wants, your joys, your sorrows, your cares, and your fears before God. You cannot burden him. You cannot weary him. He who numbers the hairs of your head is not indifferent to the wants of his children. The Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. That's from James 5 and verse 11. His heart of love is touched by our sorrows and even by our utterances of them. Take to him everything that perplexes the mind. Nothing is too great for him to bear, for he holds up worlds. He rules over all the affairs of the universe. Nothing in any way concerns our peace is too small for him to notice. There is no chapter in our experience too dark for him to read. There is no perplexity too difficult for him to unravel. Amen. He can do it all. Now, the other thing that plagues us is doubt and uncertainty, which we see here in this story. This is the tempest we all share in life's problems, the ups and the downs. We often come to a time when we do not know what to do. It is at these times we need to turn to Jesus and say, Lord, what will you have me to do? Then through prayer and meditation on his word, we can humbly submit to his guidance. The way to a peace amid this tempest is to submit to his will. What does it say in 1 John 4:4? It says, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And that's right. It is very true. The last one here is anxiety. The number one enemy of our peace is worry and anxiety. Worry for ourselves, worry about the future, worry about those we love. People will do anything to relieve their anxiety. It is why we become dependent on the things of this world, really, because we'll do anything to relieve our anxiety. Jesus speaks to us about a Father who will never leave us or forsake us. We shall never shed a needless tear, and his love is beyond anything we can imagine. His love for us, it knows no bounds. In Psalm 103 and verse 13, it says, as a father pitieth his children, even so the Lord pitieth them that fear him. He sees our weakness. He is aware of our shortcomings. Afflictions are designed to help us, because bear with us continually. We have to think about this thing that the disciples needed to think about there. The boat will not sink, and the storm will pass. Because his love for us knows no bounds. Too often, we are just like the disciples in their efforts to save themselves. They forget Jesus. He was right there in the boat with them. Yet only in their utter despair did they turn to him for help. And that does not have to be the case. A lot of times, I look at these old hymnals. We've had the same hymnal in this church for many, many years now, the one that is in the thing there. And they're supposed to change them like every 25 years. I think it's been since the late 70s that we've had this one here. And the hymnal before that was this one, if anybody has seen this. There's a lot of different hymns in this hymnal. And one of them I looked up because of this scriptures that I was reading, and it's called Master, the Tempest is Raging. And one of the lyrics says, linger, O blessed Redeemer, leave me alone no more. Linger, O blessed Redeemer, leave me alone no more. So we might be reminded of that beautiful line. I did a little research on that hymn and when it came out and when it was very popular in the United States. And back in 1881, and of course Mrs. White was alive in 1881, our church was growing in 1881, and James Garfield was the 20th president of the United States. And James Garfield had the sad distinction of being our second president to be assassinated. On July 2nd, 1881, at 9:30 a.m. at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station, on his way to deliver a speech at his alma mater, Williams College. Garfield had no bodyguards, no Secret Service then. He was accompanied by his sons, James and Harry, Secretary of State Blaine, and interestingly enough, Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's son. He was shot in the back by a deranged man, Charles Goutet. President Garfield did not die immediately, but the poor medical practices of the day did lead to his suffering a long and painful death. He lingered until he passed on September 19th, 1881. And sometimes the tempests that come have an effect on the entire nation. And this hymn first came to prominence because of the nation's sorrow for its fallen president. They sang this hymn, and everybody remembered the words, linger, O blessed Redeemer, leave me alone no more. They also sung another hymn at his funeral services around the country then, and it was hymn number 529 in our hymnals, Under His Wings. And it was sung throughout the country. So let us rise as we finish this morning and think about what the Lord can do for us, that the storms will pass in life. The boat will not sink. We stay strong in our faith in the Lord. Amen. Let us rise and sing hymn number 529.